They were phenomenal. And then listen, I pulled in a CEO. Like I'd been through kind of an interim CEO and another one, and this guy named Steve Mullaney from he was VP of marketing and then interim CEO at Palo Alto Networks. And he came in and he was just such a believer. Like honestly, the guy didn't even have a background in this stuff. Like I mean, like we're a bunch of kind of nerdy PhD students with like a crazy idea, in a shitty old dentist's office, literally. And he comes in as this kind of VP of marketing type, he'd been an interim CEO, but like really understood go to market. And it was just like this battery was plugged into us and he kind of made us all believe again. And like together we built a big business.
That's interesting. I get why you pulled in. So I get how he was very helpful to you. You pulled in Steve as CEO. But it's so funny, and I don't mean this to negate his presence at all, but it might come across, but that's totally not my intention. But it feels like even though you weren't the CEO, you were the force behind it, and there was this presence and energy behind you. How did that translate in operating the company? Clearly, he had his value. You had your inherent, like intrinsic motivation to do this. How did that translate to operating the company? How did you partner?
I think this is one of the most important discussions for founders to have, and I'll tell you my rationale. My rationale is the following, which is, listen, I mean, for a period of time, we had an interim CEO that would show up one day a week, right? Like, so like, of course I was running the company then. Before that, we had a great guy, Scott Shanker, founder, very key, that was a CEO, but he was very focused on certain aspects of it. And so, we led it together. And so, one thing I realized is you need somebody full-time that does stuff that we don't know. And coming from a product, academic background, the stuff that we didn't know was go-to-market. We just didn't know that enterprise go-to-market and company building and whatever. And so you can hire someone to do that. And then the question is, what title do you give them and where do you put them? Like you have to hire somebody, right? It's like, unless you're going to learn everything yourself, you have to hire this in. So, you normally have two options. You can hire them as like a COO or a CRO, or you can hire them as a CEO. And my rationale was I'll get somebody better if I give them the CEO title. So, and I want somebody that's better, not worse. It's not like my job's going to change. So they will be more effective with a CEO title because they'll be empowered because the organization will listen to them. And as long as I believe that we can work as a team, as a pair, it's a win for everyone. Like they'll be empowered, I can attract a better person. But as long as I don't lose kind of control. And so you have to be very careful about the type of person you do, but this is kind of who Steve Mullaney was, which is CEO title. We did everything together. We did fundraising together. We did strategy. We did marketing. We did hiring. I mean, everything. And, he wasn't an ego first person. And so, if it wasn't for him, we never would have built the company that we built. But I don't think he could have just joined any company. I mean, I think that we were just a good team. And so I do think it's very important for founders, if you're from a product or technical background, you have to pull in that type of functionality. And the question is, where do you want to put it in the org and what do you want to focus on? And by the way, it worked great. I mean, we led together. There's no confusion internally. And a lot of that was just because he was so flexible.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember, you don't know this about me, but I was actually at Nebula in 2011.
No kidding, sure.
Yeah, I was there for like 10, 11 months.
Was that Chris
Camp, yeah. Chris Camp, Steve O'Hara. I was working with Cole Crawford and
Cole.
all those guys.
Yeah, I love Cole.
So I'm familiar with like from Nicira from those days. Sure. And Project Quantum was brand new because, as you know, it started off with just like the core, storage, compute, identity management. But before that, Nicira was a company for a good amount of years before that.
Yeah.
How formative? How do you keep a company going? I guess it was customers that were just not being announced. Was that what it was? It was kind of like under the covers. How would you describe that period before OpenStack arose and then Quantum and then Nicira truly started to kind of get a little bit more out there? Yeah.
So here's my belief, rightly or wrongly. My belief is through sheer will, even if you don't have product market fit, you can keep a company alive and do 3 to 5 million a year in bookings just through sheer will. I mean, and I've seen it happen so many times. And it's just the grind. It's like, trying to find the next use case, trying to find some way of dislodging money, trying to find an interested customer or whatever. And so I would say for the first 3 years, it was just sheer will. I mean, we had a deployment of a software-defined network at a place called Tokyo Medical and Dental University, in Tokyo. We had engagements with NEC. We had engagements with Citrix, where we built kind of a product for them that was a competitor to VMware. We were working with Google at the time. And so, we were always finding something somewhere, to dislodge some money, but none of it looked even remotely like a repeatable product in market. And in fact, actually, when A16Z made the investment, Mark Andreessen was like, but what are you selling? I'm like, yeah, that's a good question. Early on, I mean, it was just kind of this very amorphous thing. So the inflection point happened and it was in 2008. So about a year and a half in, we actually knew what we were going to build. And actually, if you look at the series, what would be called the Series A slide deck, the one that we gave to Andreessen Horowitz, it's almost exactly what we ended up filling. So let me tell you what that was. So here was the inflection point. The inflection point was in 2008. One of the biggest trends was virtualization, right? The creation of VMware. And if you looked at it, I remember there was an announcement that got me thinking, and the announcement was there's more virtual machines than physical servers, more virtual servers than physical servers now. And I remember thinking like, wow, that's a big deal, man. And VMware was like, it IPO'd and, $30 billion entity or whatever it was at the time. I don't totally recall, but it became a big company. And I thought, for every one of those, virtual machines, it has a virtual NIC, right? And if you have 40 of those on one server, you need to do networking, man. You can't not do networking before 40 things, like whether it's security or it's QoS or whatever it is. And so I said, you know what? VMware is going to be a larger networking company than Cisco by 2012. It's going to have more physical ports than Cisco does, just by that.
You're probably the only guy in the world that actually thought that.
Well, it was pretty early. It was pretty early, actually. It was interesting. There was someone within VMware, a guy named Andrew Lambeth, who was also just kind of really understood the power. And so we ended up hiring Andrew Lambeth. And then we just basically said, what we're going to do is we're going to do what VMware did to servers, but we're going to do it for the network, and we're going to do it by building in the hypervisor. And we just had once we had that, we knew the technology we've been developing was very good for that problem. We had a macro trend that was going on. It was going after a large market, which is a $40 billion market. We knew what to build. And then from that point, everything kind of fell into place, so it was kind of like a year and a half of, this kind of not really sure what to happen, but as soon as it fell in, and then we just executed against that for the next 4 years.
And were you building primarily with so ESX, or were you kind of doing stuff with Zen and KVM and all the other hypervisors, or was it?
So we couldn't do it with VMware because it was a closed platform.
It was closed. That's right.
So So it was all Zen and KVM. So like early customers were like Rackspace, I think when we launched the company, I think we launched it with the some of the 5 largest companies in the world. It was like AT&T, NTT, Rackspace, eBay, and Fidelity. And so we went to like the largest customers that had virtual infrastructure that weren't using VMware, and we built out their virtual networking layer. That's what we did. But the goal was always, every virtual machine needs to have one of our virtual ports to it.
Now, so if you were to look at the grand scheme of things, where OpenFlow, which was essentially like the way I'm thinking of OpenFlow was, it was like an API or some sort of protocol to talk to the switches, the virtual switches. And so the more switch vendors you had that were implementing an OpenFlow API and exposing the OpenFlow, I guess, endpoints, if you will, the better it would be to kind of have SDN's vision be fulfilled. How did you go about getting all these vendors in? And then talk about the community just for a second, because when you say community, what was a community for OpenFlow and for SDN in those days?
Yeah, well, so it's interesting. So I think Nicira's path separated from the SDN OpenFlow path in the moment that we made that observation, right? So the original view of OpenFlow was, if you get a switch, there's no way for me to control it, the forwarding rule. So why don't you expose a protocol? Oh, by the way, here's one open flow. It's fine. And it was a crappy protocol, but like the idea was, let me just go ahead and be able to kind of populate the forwarding tables of a switch. And then the whole idea of how you do that and how you build the control software and what that means to networking became software-defined networking. And that's like the conferences around this and so forth. So that was like the direct kind of result of the PhD research we did, and it became this whole thing. But at the moment we were like, actually, it's actually all about virtualization. The physical switches didn't matter anymore. And so instead, we built a project called Open vSwitch, which is still in the Linux kernel. And what that does, it's a software switch that runs in the Linux kernel. And then we built a product called NVP, the Network Virtualization Platform, that would connect to all of those and build a virtual networking layer that did everything in software on x86 at the edge. So it didn't do anything in the actual network. And so we didn't require any integration with switches at all. And so the OpenFlow
sorry to stop you. I just want to, you just casually threw in, it's in the Linux kernel. That's a big freaking deal. That it made it in.
I mean, it was a huge effort to get it in. And I remember like Dave Miller hated it. Like it was like all the politics around that, whatever. But listen, now, Open vSwitch, and then, we created on top of that an actual open network overlay called OVN, which is still kind of in use today, Open Virtual Network. And I mean, it's interesting if you actually look at like the artifacts from that, like actually the team that was building the policy layer for the solution, it was an OpenStack, a project called Congress. Now they've created OPA, it's an open policy agent, which is like, in popular use in the Kubernetes platform. So I think there's still a lot of reverberations around this early work. But we had to work. So let me step back. You asked the question about community. OpenFlow and SDN was largely like a vendor and academic led thing on how you change networking, writ large, like networking vendors. So it's like Cisco and Ericsson and Juniper and all the academics and the Googles and the Facebooks that want to build their own switches and Broadcom who does the silicon. And that's its own thing that goes today, and it's awesome and they do great work and whatever. But that was very different than the path we took. The path we took was you can do all of this in software. You can do all of this in the edge. And so then we started getting involved in the projects around that. This is the Linux kernel. OpenStack at the time was very important. Like to your point, we started Nebula, or not Nebula, Quantum, which was the networking layer. We did Congress, which is the policy layer, and that's what is kind of a grandfather of OPA. And so then we became basically network virtualization folks rather than SDN folks, and that was 2009 through 2012.